There's a specific kind of silence that fills a truck cab when you've turned off the engine outside a church you weren't invited into. Not the silence of peace. The silence of a man doing arithmetic he never wanted to do. I sat in that parking lot for 25 minutes, and I counted every one of them, because I'm the kind of man who counts things. 41 years I spent running a machine shop in this town, and before that I was the kind of kid who understood that the world held together better when somebody kept track of it. 25 minutes. 9 cars in that lot I recognized. One was my daughter-in-law's Buick. One was my son's truck. One was a Lexus belonging to people I'd never met. Folks who I'd later learn were special guests at my own granddaughter's christening. I hadn't been told there was a christening. I found out from Doris Pemberton, who lives 2 doors down from me and has for 19 years, who came by Thursday evening with a plate of deviled eggs she'd made just because, and who mentioned, the way a woman mentions the weather, that she'd seen the photos my daughter-in-law posted of little Grace in a white gown getting ready for her big day this Saturday. "Wasn't that special?" Doris said. "Wasn't that just the sweetest thing?" I said yes, it surely was. I went inside. I set Doris's eggs on the counter. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time without moving a muscle, and then I got up, got my keys, and drove to Grace Chapel Baptist Church, 40 minutes across the county line, and I parked across the street where I could see the doors, but nobody inside could see me. This is where it starts. But it doesn't really start here. It starts 11 years before that Saturday, in a filing cabinet in the back office of a machine shop, with a decision I made that not one soul in my family knew was coming. And if you're the kind of man or woman who has ever sat outside a room where your own blood was celebrating something and you weren't welcome in it, I want you to stay with me, friend, because by the time I'm done telling you this, you're going to understand exactly why I didn't drive home that morning. I wasn't waiting on an invitation. I was waiting on something I'd already built. My name is Walter Kessler. I'm 68 years old. I've got arthritis in both hands from 4 decades of machine work, and I've buried a wife, which is its own kind of arithmetic I won't get into right now. What I want to tell you about is my daughter-in-law, Renee, and how she decided, about 5 years back, that she didn't care for me much. Now I want to be fair here, because being fair is the only thing that's ever gotten me anywhere in 68 years. Renee didn't wake up one morning and decide to dislike me over some single thing I did. It built up slow, the way rust builds on a fender. You don't wash enough a little judgment here, a little judgment there, until one day the whole panel's eaten through and you're standing there wondering when exactly it happened. I'm a plain-spoken man. I say what's true and I don't wrap it in a bow to make it prettier going down. 41 years running a shop floor will do that to you. That trade doesn't pay you for being liked. It pays you for being right, and being right without being kind starts to feel like the same thing as being right, until one day somebody shows you it isn't. Renee took my plainness for coldness. She took my directness for judgment, and the fact that I never learned to perform warmth the way some folks perform it, with the big compliments and the easy hugs and all that social oil that some personalities run on. She took that to mean I didn't love her or her children. That wasn't true. I loved my granddaughter Grace and her older brother Dalton, the way a grandfather loves grandchildren, which is a particular kind of love that doesn't need a performance behind it to be real. But real and visible aren't always the same animal, friend. And I hadn't in 5 years done the work of making my love visible to a woman whose language for love was different from mine. That's my part in this. I want to say it plain, because I'm not interested in telling you a story where I did nothing wrong. I corrected Renee once, gently I thought, about a loan she and my son Bobby were taking out on a truck they couldn't rightly afford, and I was right about the math, and I said it in front of Bobby, in a way that left her no room to save face. I understand now that was the hinge point. Not what I said, how I said it, and where I said it, and who was standing there to hear it. She never let go of that morning. Over the next 5 years, Renee eased me out of things. That's the only honest word for what happened. Quiet, steady, patient as a dripping faucet. Fewer invitations. Shorter visits when there were visits. A slow narrowing of the days Grandpa Walter got included in, until being there was the surprise, instead of the expectation. Bobby, my son, he's 42 now, and I love that boy completely, but I understand he's got one particular weakness, and it's that he's never learned to fight for anything inside his own house. He's good at plenty of things. Good father, good provider, calls me every Sunday evening without fail and asks about my hip and actually waits for the answer. But when it comes to standing up to Renee on something she's already made her mind up about, my son goes quiet the way a man goes quiet in a hailstorm, waiting it out instead of doing anything about it. I watched all of it happen. I wasn't idle about it, mind you. I tried, in my own limited way, to hold the line. I went to what I was invited to and I showed up for it with everything I had. I brought Grace picture books about how things worked, instead of toys she'd forget in a month, because I wanted that child to associate her grandfather with the specific pleasure of something that lasts. I took her to the county fair twice when Renee was working a double shift and Bobby needed the help, and those 2 afternoons are among the finest hours I've had in the last 5 years. Grace called me Grandpa the way a 3-year-old calls the sky blue, like a fact, not an opinion, something that simply was. No politics attached to it whatsoever. I held on to that. Then Renee didn't invite me to my own granddaughter's christening. I sat at my kitchen table for a long stretch. Then I got up, got my keys, and drove. Now, before I tell you what happened outside that church, I have to back up and tell you about the 11 years before it, because the church parking lot isn't the story, friend. It's just where the story finally came up for air. 11 years back, I made a phone call to a man named Arthur Nakamura, who'd worked the front office at my machine shop for 14 years before he retired in 2015 to do what he said he'd always been best at, which was making other people's money behave better than they did on their own. Arthur was 61 at the time. He ran a small financial planning practice out of a converted feed store on the edge of town, an arrangement he chose specifically, because he said the smell of old grain kept his head clear. In 41 years around numbers, Arthur was the sharpest man I ever worked beside, and he didn't waste a syllable on things that didn't need one. I told Arthur what I'd been watching: the slow squeeze, the pattern of it, the particular way a man doesn't always know how far he's been pushed out of a room until he steps back far enough to measure the distance. I also told him about the shop. See, back in 1994, when Bobby was 8 years old and had just informed me he wanted to grow up to be a rodeo clown and then a fireman and possibly also a horse, I'd bought 2 acres of scrubland on the edge of the industrial park, back when it was nothing but weeds and a dry creek bed nobody wanted. What the county's long-range plan described, if you knew how to read those documents, which I did. I read zoning plans the way other men read the sports page, was a rail spur coming through, the kind of infrastructure investment that takes 15, 20 years to land, and moves a piece of dirt from worthless to valuable, in a way you can't see happening until it's already happened. I bought those 2 acres for $11,000. In 42 years I had never told Bobby the whole truth of what that land had turned into. Not because I was hiding it, because the whole truth needed context he didn't have yet, and the moment for that conversation hadn't come around in the proper shape. I told Arthur the number the county's most recent assessment showed. He looked at that figure the particular way a man looks at a big number when he's spent 40 years around big numbers, not surprised, just quietly confirming something he'd already suspected. He said, "Walter." I said, "I know." He said, "This is what you've been sitting on." I said, "The land's been sitting. I've been working." He almost smiled. He said, "What do you want done with it?" I said, "I want it protected. I want it structured, so the decisions belonging to it are mine, permanent, no conditions, regardless of what anybody around me does between now and the day I'm gone. And I want one particular person taken care of in a way that's documented, permanent, and can't be talked out of by sentiment or by somebody managing the family calendar." Arthur said, "Your granddaughter." I said, "My granddaughter." He said, "And the conditions on the rest?" I said, "We'll get to those. I want to talk them through careful." He said, "Walter, are you expecting something specific to happen?" I said, "I'm a man who prepares for what the numbers are telling him is likely, and the numbers have been telling me something for close to a year now." He said, "And the christening?" I said, "Hasn't happened yet." He said, "But you think something like it's coming?" I looked at Arthur across that old feed store desk. I said, "I believe a pattern has a direction to it, Arthur, and in my experience, directions don't reverse on their own." He said, "So you're building the reason it should." I said, "I'm building the structure. The reason's already sitting there waiting." He said, "All right, Walter, let's do this properly." What Arthur and I put together over the next 11 months wasn't complicated, but it was thorough, same as everything I ever did on a shop floor. We brought in a lawyer named Priscilla Odom, recommended by Arthur, a woman who'd handled more mineral rights and land transfer cases, she told me, than she could comfortably count in 26 years of practice. She didn't use 10 words where 4 would do, and I respected the hell out of that. We set up a trust, the Walter James Kessler Family Land Trust, named with about as much poetry as a man puts into naming a socket wrench. The 2 acres, now worth considerably more than $11,000, went into that trust. I was trustee for my lifetime. Priscilla's firm was named successor trustee. And the beneficiary structure, this is the part that matters to everything that happened after, was tiered. Grace was the primary beneficiary. Unconditional. Whatever happened between me and Bobby and Renee, and who got invited to what, Grace was protected, full stop. That was the first thing I built. And it was the most important thing I built. And I need you to hear me say, it wasn't a bargaining chip. It was a statement. Grace never did one single thing to earn the squeeze she got put through by proxy. She was 3 years old and she called me Grandpa the way she called the sky blue, and she was going to be looked after no matter what else happened around her. The other provisions, the conditional ones, dealt with things about my own care and my access to my grandchildren going forward conditions. Priscilla drafted with the same precision Arthur brought to a balance sheet, because a properly written legal document says things a conversation can't always say without somebody's feelings getting in the way of the truth. There was one more thing, something Arthur suggested, and I want to walk you through it slow because it's the piece that put me in that parking lot outside the church. I had a formal appraisal done, current market value, certified appraiser, notarized, filed permanent with the trust records, and I arranged to have a copy of that appraisal, along with the trust paperwork naming Grace as primary beneficiary, delivered to my house on a date I picked out myself. I picked the Saturday of the christening. Not because I knew about the christening yet, I didn't know a thing about it when I set that date. I picked it because it felt structurally right. 11 months of building something, friend, and you start to develop a sense for when it's ready to land. Doris told me Thursday. The envelope showed up Saturday morning, 90 minutes before I got in my truck. I carried it inside. Set it on the table right next to Doris's deviled eggs. I didn't open it. I already knew what was in it. I'd built every piece of what was in it with my own 2 hands, in a manner of speaking. I left it sitting there and I got my keys. 25 minutes in a parked truck is a long stretch of time when the radio's off and the engine's off, and all you've got for company is the sound of a Saturday morning happening to other people. I thought about Grace inside that church, in the white gown Doris had described, whether she was fussing at the collar the way babies do, whether anybody had told her not that she'd understand it at 3, but whether anybody had even said the word Grandpa out loud that morning, or whether they just quietly steered around the empty space where I should have been standing. I thought about Bobby, about my son at 42 and the man he'd turned into, and the particular look that crossed his face when he was carrying something he didn't want to be carrying. I'd seen that look at his mother's funeral. I'd seen it twice more, at moments in his working life when things went sideways and he hadn't told a soul but me. The look of a man holding more than he wants to hold and not sure where to set it down. I thought about Renee, about that photograph of Grace in her christening gown, and whether Renee had looked at it before she posted it, and thought even once about who might see it and shouldn't have had to find out that way. Whether Doris was the only one who'd noticed Grandpa wasn't in a single frame. Whether other folks who knew me had clocked the same absence and made the same quiet calculation Renee had likely made that it was simpler not to ask. I thought about that envelope sitting on my kitchen table, about what it held and what it meant, and how it was going to land when Bobby finally opened it in the quiet of his own kitchen with his coffee going cold in front of him. 11 months of patience, about to arrive, right where it was headed. It wasn't revenge. I need you to hear that plain, because I've turned this thought over more times than I can count. It was documentation. It was the record of what a man had built, and who he'd built it for, and a declaration in the permanent language of a notarized instrument that the people who mattered to him were going to be taken care of, whether or not somebody remembered to send him an invitation. I was sitting with all of that when the church doors opened. Bobby wasn't walking. He was moving with that controlled urgency of a man who's just had 90 seconds of information, rearrange his whole understanding of the morning, and maybe the last 5 years along with it, and he crossed that street with his jaw set and his eyes already locked onto my truck before the door had swung all the way shut behind him. He found my window. I rolled it down. The air between us had the particular weight of a conversation that had been waiting a long while to happen. His voice was doing something I hadn't heard it do since he was 13, and came to find me after he'd put a baseball through Mrs. Halloran's greenhouse. That same mix of scared and ashamed a boy gets when he respects his father and knows good and well he's messed something up. Same frequency, 42 years old now, standing in a church parking lot with his daughter's christening happening behind him. He said, "Dad, you gotta come inside. Right now. Please." I said, "What happened in there, Bobby?" He said, "Grace has been fussing for you since we got her dressed this morning. Little Dalton keeps asking where Grandpa Walter is. He made you something, Dad. A drawing. He's been holding on to it since we left the house, waiting to give it to you, and nobody told him you weren't coming, 'cause nobody told him you weren't invited in the first place." He said, Renee figured he'd get distracted, focus on his sister, on the party after. He didn't get distracted. He's sitting in that pew right now holding a piece of paper for a man who isn't there, and he's 6 years old, Dad. Please. I said, "And Renee?" A pause. The particular kind of pause a man gives when he already knows what's sitting on the other side of it and isn't sure how to say it out loud. He said, "Renee's starting to understand what she did." I said, "Is she?" He said, "Dad, your grandson is holding a drawing he made for you and he's 6 years old." I looked at my son. I let the moment sit there one more beat than it wanted to. Then I said, "I know he's 6, Bobby. I've known about this christening for going on 2 weeks. I knew there'd be a service and a lunch after, and I knew I wasn't going to be sitting in that pew. I drove out here anyway. I've been parked across this street for 25 minutes. And the reason I'm still sitting in this truck isn't because I don't want to walk in there." He said, "Then why?" I said, "Because I need you to understand something before I go through those doors." He said, "Tell me." I said, "There's an envelope on my kitchen table. I left it there this morning before I drove out. I want you to go by my house after all this is done, and I want you to open it. And when you've read what's inside, I want you to call me, and we're going to have a conversation we should have had a good while before today." He looked at me with the face of a man who doesn't yet know what's in an envelope but can tell from the way it's been described that the envelope matters. He said, "Okay, Dad." I said, "Now let's go see your kids." I got out of the truck. If you're watching this and you know what it feels like to sit outside a room full of people you love who don't even know you're parked out there, I want you to hit that like button right now. Not for me. For every grandparent who's ever been eased out of a family by somebody who forgot Grandpa was there first, before any of the rest of it started. Subscribe if you haven't already, because what happened once I walked through those doors, and what happened when Bobby finally opened that envelope, are two different kinds of moment, and both of them matter. Stick with me. I walked into Grace Chapel and found my grandson first. Dalton was sitting at the end of a pew in his little clip-on tie, twisted sideways the way a 6-year-old's tie always ends up by mid-morning. When he spotted me coming down that aisle, he did something I'm going to be honest with you about, and it put a feeling in my chest I'm not going to try naming, because anything less than the exact right word isn't worth saying at all. He hollered, "Grandpa Walter." Full volume. The complete unself-consciousness of a 6-year-old who doesn't understand or care that half the church has gone quiet. He said it the way he always said it, like a fact, not a question. He came running down that aisle holding a folded piece of construction paper. He shoved it into my hands before I'd even gotten all the way down on one knee to meet him. He said, "I made this for you, 'cause you weren't here yet and I wanted you to have it when you came." I took the drawing. On the front, in the specific abstract style of a 6-year-old's art, he'd drawn 2 figures, one big, one small. The big one had glasses, same as me. Between them he'd drawn something I eventually made out to be a fishing rod, because Dalton and I go fishing at the pond behind my property every chance we get. Underneath, in the careful, deliberate handwriting of a child who's just learned letters go in a specific order, and is working hard to honor that order, it said, "I love you, Grandpa. You are my best one." I held that drawing a moment. Then I put my arms around my grandson in the middle of his sister's christening, in a church I'd sat outside for 25 minutes, and I held him the way you hold something you almost didn't get to hold. The pew went quiet. I looked up. Renee was watching me from across the aisle, with the particular expression of a woman who's spent 5 years certain about something, and has just watched a 6-year-old's handmade drawing and his grandfather's face put a price tag on that certainty she wasn't ready to pay. I didn't say a word to her, didn't need to. I stood, found the seat Bobby had quietly pulled over for me sometime between the parking lot and the church door, and I sat down, and I put Dalton's drawing in my shirt pocket, where it stayed the rest of the day. We got through the rest of the service. Grace didn't cry once during the water part, which Doris later told me was practically a miracle for a baby that age. There was a lunch after, at the fellowship hall, and Dalton wouldn't leave my side the entire time, showing me a rock he'd found in the parking lot that he was convinced had a fossil in it. Renee's parents sat across the table from me. Her father shook my hand when I sat down. Her mother gave me a smile of the kind people give when they're not entirely sure what happened but know something did. I nodded back. I smiled back. I was there for my grandchildren. Everybody else at that table was just the room around them. Bobby came by my place Sunday morning, alone, carrying the envelope. He'd clearly opened it the night before. Even the seal was already broken and the edges had that soft-handled look of paper that's been folded and unfolded a few times too many. He sat down at my kitchen table, set the envelope in front of him, looked at me. He said, "Dad, the land." I said, "Yes." He said, "I knew you bought something back in '94. I didn't know what it had turned into." I said, "Nobody knew. The information wasn't relevant till it was." He said, "And now it's relevant." I said, "Now there's decisions to be made about it that need a conversation I've been trying to find the right moment for." He said, "The trust." I said, "Yes." He said, "Grace is the beneficiary." I said, "Grace is the primary beneficiary, unconditional. Whatever happens between you and me, or you and Renee, or the invitations, or the parking lots, Grace is protected." That was the first decision I made, and it's not a negotiable one. He looked down at the appraisal. He said, "Dad, this is," and he stopped himself. I said, "I know what it is." He was quiet, a long stretch. Then he said, "Why didn't you tell me?" I said, "Because telling you needed a conversation, and the conversation needed you ready to have it straight, and I've been waiting on that moment a good while, and it finally showed up yesterday in a church parking lot." He said, "I didn't know she hadn't invited you." I said, "I believe you." He said, "I want you to know I believe that you believe me. And I also want you to know that not knowing is its own kind of failing. When you quit paying attention to how the people you love are being treated, you're on the hook for what happens in your inattention, whether you meant it or not." He said, "That's fair." I said, "I know it is. I also know it's a lot easier to say than to actually live." He was quiet. I said, "Bobby, I need to tell you something about Renee." He looked up. I said, "She didn't decide to squeeze me out of Grace and Dalton's lives because she's a bad person. She decided it because 5 years ago I handled something wrong, and I made her feel small in front of you, and she never let go of that. And I'm not going to sit here and tell you the rest of this is entirely her doing, because it isn't. I played my part." He said, "You always told me you handled that wrong." I said, "I told you. I never told her. That's the difference." He said, "What are you saying?" I said, "I'm saying before we talk any further about the trust and the land and this envelope, I need to sit across from your wife and say something I should have said 5 years ago. And I'm saying whatever happens from here on out, the structure, the documentation, all of it, it depends on whether that conversation's even possible." Bobby looked at me the way a man looks when he's watched two people he loves drift in opposite directions for 5 years and just got told there might be a third direction neither of them had tried yet. He said, "She'll sit down with you." I said, "You certain?" He said, "She was tore up last night, Dad. Not at you. At herself. She sat with that drawing Dalton made for a long time. The one he made 'cause he didn't know if you'd show." He said, "I think she's been sitting with a lot of things." I said, "Good. So have I." The conversation with Renee happened on a Tuesday evening. Bobby sat in for the start of it, then found a reason to go check on the kids, the way a man does when he understands some conversations need room to breathe on their own. Renee sat across from me at my own kitchen table. She wasn't performing calm. She was actually calm, the way people get when they've already done the hard internal work and all that's left is the saying of it out loud. She said, "I owe you an apology." I said, "So do I." She looked at me. Whatever she'd expected out of my mouth, that wasn't it. I said, 5 years back, I told you your finances were wrong in a way that didn't leave you a shred of room to be anything but wrong in front of your husband. That was true information delivered the wrong way. and I've never once told you straight that I handled it badly, and that I'm sorry for it." She said, "You're apologizing to me?" I said, "I am. And I'd have done it sooner if I'd understood sooner what it cost you." What I didn't see for too long is that plain talk without any warmth mixed in is just criticism wearing a clean shirt. "You deserved better than that from me." Renee sat quiet a moment. Then she said, "I shouldn't have done what I did with the christening, with any of it. I kept telling myself it was simpler this way, easier on the household, and I kept not looking at what it was actually doing. What it was doing to Dalton," she said. "He talks about you all the time, Walter, about the fishing, about the pond, about the way you explain things to him. I kept not letting myself hear how bad he needed you around." She said, "He made that drawing 3 days before the christening. I watched him make it." She stopped. I said, "He gave it to me." She said, "I know." I said, "It's in my shirt pocket." She looked at me. Then she did something I hadn't expected. She laughed a small, broken sort of laugh that wasn't about anything being funny, just about the plain absurdity of a 6-year-old's drawing fixing something 5 years of grown-up decisions had broken. I said, "Renee, I'm not asking you to like me. I'm asking you to let me be their grandfather. That's the only thing I've ever actually wanted out of any of this." She said, "You should have just asked me that straight out." I said, "You're right, I should have." She said, "I'd have said yes." I said, "I believe you would have. I think both of us made this a lot harder than it ever needed to be." She said, "Yes." I said, "Can we agree we're done making it harder?" She looked down at the table, then back at me. She said, "Yes, Walter, we can agree to that. The trust hasn't changed one word. Grace is still the primary beneficiary, and that's not going to change, regardless of whatever comes next, because that decision was never about Renee or Bobby or who gets invited where. It was about a 3-year-old girl and her 6-year-old brother, who made me a drawing 3 days before a christening he wasn't sure I'd even be at. That's the kind of love that deserves more than good intentions standing behind it. It deserves a trust, and a land appraisal, and a legal structure that says, in the permanent language of a notarized document, that these children matter to this man, and this man built something to prove it. What's changed is Sundays. Bobby calls every Sunday evening still, but Dalton gets on the phone now too, on his own, to tell me about a fish he saw or a question he's been chewing on that he's decided Grandpa would know the answer to. Last week he called to ask why catfish don't have scales. We talked 20 minutes. I keep a record of calls like that, the way I keep records of everything that matters, which is to say I write it down in a little notebook with the date at the top. Renee and I have sat down 3 more times since that Tuesday. Those conversations aren't easy ones. They're honest ones. I'm learning, slow, to say the warm thing right alongside the true thing. She's learning, I believe, to hear the true thing without automatically hearing judgment folded up inside it. We're both still learning. I suspect we'll both be learning a good while yet. That's enough. Learning is enough. I want to talk to you plain for just a minute before I let you go. If you're a grandmother or a grandfather who's been eased out of a family the way I was, I need you to hear this. The distance isn't proof you aren't loved. More often than not, it's proof something went sideways between people who weren't you, at a level you weren't fully a part of, and the strongest thing you can do isn't to fight the distance head on. It's to make yourself impossible to forget to the one person who never had a hand in any of the deciding. Dalton made me a drawing 3 days before a christening he didn't know I wasn't invited to. He made it just in case. Be the grandparent a 6-year-old makes something for. Just in case. The rest tends to follow. Share this with somebody in your life who needs to hear it today. Hit that like button, subscribe so you don't miss the next one, and leave me a comment below. Tell me about a time a child showed you something a grown-up had spent years making complicated. I read every last one of them, friend, so don't be shy.